Well, welcome everyone to the Buddhist Society and these celebrating the 100 years of the Buddhist Society from 1924 till 2024. And we should also thank the Numata Foundation for making it possible to give these lectures. And so we're on the second main group on Zen Buddhism, and this is the last of the talks on Zen Buddhism. And Thomas Yuho Kirchner will be talking to us on thoughts on meditation. So without more ado, Tom, I would like to thank you also very much for coming over, and the preparation that goes into these talks I know is very time consuming. So thank you very much, Tom. And a big welcome to Venerable Kassapa and to Professor Sato. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, this evening also I would like to start with 3 recitations of the 4 vows. So without further ado, Shijō Muen Seigan Dobon no Mujin Seigan Dan Homon Muryo Seigan Aku Mujo Seigan Jo Ashijo Muen Seigan Dobon no Mujin Seigan Dan Omon Muryo Seigan Agubetsudo Mujo Seigan Jo Shujo Muen Seigan No Om Jin Seigan Dan Homon Muryo Seigan Gagu Butsudo Mujo Seigan Jo. Okay, well, the title of today's talk is Thoughts on Meditation. These are basically just a discussion of a few more of my thoughts on the practice of meditation. A bit of a hodgepodge, I'm afraid. A few not necessarily related things I've kind of observed over my years in Japan. I think some of the things that I'm going to mention might resonate with most of you, and some of them might be completely dismissed. But at any rate, I hope it's interesting. I will, because of the subject matter, be going over a few of the subjects, briefly, that I've covered before, but I've tried, to minimize that as much as possible. The subject is meditation, which is, of course, a huge subject with Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, basically all of the major religions, having their own contemplative traditions. But generally speaking, I think that it's Buddhism that is the tradition that is mostly strong associated in the minds of most people with the practice of meditation. It's actually become a kind of symbol of Buddhism almost. For example, if an artist wants to indicate that the person they're depicting is a Buddhist, they basically just show the person sitting in a cross-legged posture. For this talk, for example, I looked up Buddhist monk cartoons on the internet, and virtually all of the cartoons show the monks in temples or caves sitting in the cross-legged posture. There was one I particularly thought was amusing, was one that showed a young monk seated in meditation, of course, asking his teacher, "Oh, master, is it proper for a monk to use email?" And the teacher answers, "Yes, as long as there are no attachments." But I think in some ways this image of Buddhism as a religion centering on the practice of meditation is a bit misleading. Buddhism is, after all, a world religion. with estimates of the number of Buddhists in the world being around 400 or 500 million. So Buddhism has to serve the spiritual needs of a very wide variety of individuals. And frankly speaking, most of these people, like people everywhere, they're not really all that interested in meditating. Thus, the various Buddhist traditions offer their followers a wide variety of practices other than meditation. For example, the Pure Land traditions of Buddhism, which Shin belongs to, that offers followers, the practice of devotional practices like the Nembutsu. This is the most popular range of traditions in Asia. There are also traditions like the Japanese Shingon and Tendai schools, which do have meditation practices, but they focus much more on esoteric ritual. The fact is that I think meditation in any religion is a rather rare vocation. I used to think that in the Catholic Church, for example, monks in contemplative orders like the Trappists focused their spiritual life on specifically Christian types of meditation, such as the prayer of silence or the various, prayer systems used by St. John of the Cross. During stays at Trappist monasteries, however, I've seen that the great majority of the monks there are concerned pretty much solely with the liturgical practices. This is the Mass, the Gregorian chants, holy readings, things like this. Actually, at one monastery, Trappist monastery I visited, I was surprised to see that the small number of monks who were in fact interested in meditation would get together before the start of the regular monastic day and do Zen meditation for an hour or so. They even had all of their own zafus. The situation in Buddhism is somewhat the same. There's a Buddhist teacher in America, quite well known there, named Jack Hornfield, who, in writing about his years of practice in Southeast Asia, estimated that even in contemplative traditions like the forest monks, the number of monks who meditate seriously is probably around 10%. I'm not sure of that, but anyway, I wouldn't be surprised. That's certainly the case in the contemplative orders of Christianity. Traditionally, the Buddhist laity in Southeast Asia has rarely practiced meditation. What they focus on instead is merit-making, good works, in order to be born in better circumstances in the next life. It's only with the spread, I think there has been a significant change recently with the spread of the Vipassana movement, which largely grew out, of a lay Buddhist movement. And I think nowadays, Southeast Asia and India, much larger numbers of lay people have started to meditate. This is only part of the story, of course. I mean, meditation may be a minority practice, but it still has a very important place in Buddhism. It is, after all, the practice that the Buddha himself turned to in order to resolve his spiritual questions, and it was the central practice that he taught to his disciples in order to help them see into the true nature of reality and resolve the question of human suffering. All of this, of course, raises again the question of what is meditation. I talked about this a good bit in my first lecture, but another way of looking at it, I think at the simplest level, meditation might be described as an attempt to do something about our usual scattered and confused state of mind. The American Zen writer, the American writer Mark Twain once said, "Life does not consist mainly or even largely of facts or happenings. It consists mainly of the storm of thoughts that is forever blowing through one's head." So meditation, I think, could be described as an attempt to do something constructive about this storm of thoughts. Very generally speaking, again, I think this takes two basic directions which, based on the Catholic terms, the via negativa and the via positiva. I would call, positive meditation and negative meditation. Positive meditation is positive because it affirms the thought process. In other words, it attempts to transform thoughts and feelings in a positive direction. Another way to put it, to use computer terminology, is that positive meditation endeavors to kind of reprogram the mind, to replace negative feelings with positive feelings. By negative feelings, again, generally speaking, I mean feelings that tend to increase the sense of separation between self and other. These are feelings like intolerance, jealousy, anger, hatred. So positive feelings include generosity, tolerance, forgiveness, which tend to reduce the sense of separation between self and other. In Christianity, I think the Jesuit spiritual exercises could be characterized pretty much as positive meditation. They are trying to change the way you think about how you exist in the world and how you exist, hopefully, as a person of God. In Buddhism, we have various loving kindness exercises. And something also related, maybe not quite a loving kindness exercise, but I think one that can really serve as one, is the Tibetan Tonglen practices. This is one I would like to talk about a little bit more later in this talk. Positive thoughts and feelings are very helpful, very good in that they not only promote harmonious human relations, but they also foster physical and mental health. They also remove many obstacles to spiritual growth. I mean, anger is, this is an obstacle to spiritual growth, jealousy, all of these kind of negative emotions. And they help lay the foundation for deeper levels of meditation. I think this is one reason why the Buddhist precepts strongly stress the cultivation of moral virtues. But although these positive qualities are important in the spiritual life, and I think they do tend to move us in the direction of self-transcendence, they still remain necessarily largely on the level of thought and feeling, which, as I discussed in my talk last week, is the level of ego identity. In contrast to positive meditation, negative meditation seeks to go deeper than the level of ego identity. It is negative in the sense that it negates, or rather transcends, thought, since human thought is conditioned by human experience and thus can never access that which is unconditioned. To use computer terminology again, negative meditation can be described as a kind of deprogramming of the mind to overcome our identification with thought and awaken the mind to levels of consciousness deeper than the thought construct that is ego. This is the emptying of the self, the kenosis that Christian contemplation aims for. Zazen, of course, is a form of negative meditation, as are the contemplative approaches of Christian teachers like the Cloud of Unknowing, Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross. Both positive meditation and negative meditation, I think, have their merits and demerits. Positive meditation, as I mentioned, it fosters positive qualities that are important for practice, but it's still primarily on the level of thought and thus limited in its capacity to access the deeper levels of mind. Negative meditation can access these deeper levels, but unless positive states of mind are also fostered, negative meditation can lead to some very risky conclusions. These are conclusions like, I've seen beyond the dichotomy of good and evil, so, the rules of moral behavior no longer apply to me. I mean, this is the kind of outlook that can lead to the scandals and the very hurtful behavior that has, unfortunately, more often than it should be, been seen in Western meditation centers. Such behavior, such kind of negative behavior, I should add, was found in former times as well, of course. And this is one of the reasons that the Catholic Church has tended to suppress its mystical movements, and the reason that most Buddhist denominations have always stressed the importance of the precepts and loving kindness types of meditation. Moving on to a slightly different topic. This is the topic, again, of active versus contemplative that I got into yesterday. Meditation, again, it's often had to defend itself against the proponents of a more active, socially engaged approach to religious practice. I think this is particularly true of those traditions that center on negative meditation, because the practitioners of this type of meditation have tended, again by necessity, to, more often isolate themselves from the world just to attain the kind of quiet environment that, promotes this kind of prayer practice. Just an example of the kind of blowback that we often get as meditators. During my years in the monastery, I occasionally, for various reasons, had opportunities to return to the United States. And it seemed that every time I was back, my father, who was a doctor and very much a medical scientist, would always ask me, he says, "What are you doing in the monastery? Christ was a man for the people, working in the world for humanity's salvation." Well, this is, of course, a valid criticism. I mean, one way to respond to this, I think, is kind of a practical way to respond to this, is by pointing out the many concrete and positive benefits that meditation can bring. These are the sort of benefits that, the modern research on mindfulness meditation has revealed. For example, meditation's many physical and mental health benefits, and its enhancement of qualities like concentration and equanimity. I mean, these are qualities that are sort of universal enhancers, if I could put it that way. I mean, anything you do, you're going to be able to do better if you can do this with a mind that is concentrated and a mind that is in a state of equanimity. So this can help people, even people very active in the world, to do what they do. So it has this very practical aspect to it, but I don't think this is what was really concerning my father. I think that what concerned him was more something on the lines of, wouldn't all that time you spend sitting in meditation be more spiritually beneficial if you spent it working in the hospitals or prisons? And again, I can see his point, but I believe that the contemplative life, if followed sincerely, is not as distant from the aims of the active life as it might superficially seem. I think in many ways the ideals of both the active life and the contemplative life ultimately come together. For example, people in active vocations, they make heroic efforts in caring for the sick and addressing the other sufferings in the world. And this work, in and of itself, of course, is unquestionably of great value to society and humanity as a whole. That can't be denied, I think. But according to many people I know who do this kind of work, it's not unusual at all for those in active vocations to receive no appreciation from the people they're helping, and in fact, to even experience resentment from the people that they're trying to help. Now, if this leads to bitterness, anger, or burnout, then the active life as a spiritual practice has not really succeeded. If, on the other hand, a person in an active vocation can experience this kind of resentment and this kind of lack of gratitude, yet continue on in their work in an even-minded spirit of giving, if that person in the active orders, can regard these challenges not as a cause for bitterness, but rather as an impetus for greater detachment, self-reflection, and self-understanding, then I personally would say that inwardly, such people are living as contemplative a life as any Trappist or Carthusian monk. So how about the other side of the coin? I mean, if the active life, when taken to its ideal, can become a kind of contemplative life, can the contemplative life, when it approaches its ideal, become a kind of action in the world? That is, can contemplation in and of itself become a force for salvation, not just for oneself, but for others as well? I mean, the Catholic Church certainly feels that this is the case. The other day I spoke about the Carthusian order, which has no contact with society whatsoever, and yet is regarded by the Catholic Church as being the highest of all vocations. Because the Church feels that the prayer that the Carthusians are entirely dedicating their lives to is not just a matter for the individual monks, but it sort of spreads out from the monastery and infuses everyone in the entire church. I tend to agree very much with this sort of basic idea of meditation never being limited to a single individual. And it's a subject that interests me very greatly, but it's not a subject that I can really offer much hard evidence for. What evidence that exists is pretty much just anecdotal evidence, but I find a lot of these anecdotes to be quite intriguing. For example, we don't always know what saves people. A number of years ago, I heard a very interesting story from my teacher, Shodo Roshi, about one of his students, a French monk named Dogen. Now, this is someone I know personally. This is not a story about a friend of a friend of a friend. One time, Dogen needed to apply for a new visa. So he took the night ferry from Japan to the Korean port city of Busan. Now, it was a beautiful moonlit night and the sea was glassy smooth. So after everyone had gone to their cabins for the night, Dogen went out on deck to meditate. Took his meditation, he took his cushions out to the end of the deck on the end of the ship. He sat there for a few hours, and then he returned to his cabin and went to bed. In the morning, however, as he was about to disembark at Busan, a Japanese woman came up to him and said she had to thank him. And he was very surprised, and he asked her what he meant, because he had no idea who she was or what she might be thanking him for. And she said that the man she'd been living with had recently left her, leaving her feeling terribly depressed. And she thought a change of scenery might help, so she took the ferry to Korea. But on the ship, she was feeling so despondent, she said, that she decided to commit suicide, intending to jump over the side of the ship when she was sure that no one was there. So coming out of her cabin, she looked down the deck, and she saw Dogen sitting there alone, quietly in the moonlight on the deck, at the end of the ship. And the sight of this made her stop. And she said she just stood there looking at him. Finally she decided to return to her cabin and continue on to Korea. I don't know what she was thinking. Maybe it was something like there are still things that might make life worth living that, she still knew nothing about. I really don't know, but seeing Dogen there sitting in the moonlight, that may have been the only thing that could have saved her that night. I mean, trying an active intervention or something might have been completely counterproductive. Anyway, I heard this story, as I mentioned, from Roshi, So sometime later, when I next saw Dogen myself, I mean, it was such an amazing story that I asked him, did this really happen? And he said yes. And not only that, he said, but several years after that, he had met this woman by sheer coincidence in Tokyo. And, she was doing just fine. Now, Tokyo is a city of 14 million people. So meeting her there was, just beyond an amazing coincidence. But I think, that somehow, amazing coincidence though it wasn't as amazing as the coincidence of Dogen having been there meditating. At just the moment this woman decided to end her life. As my mother always used to say, coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. I suppose, some people could say that Dogen didn't actually do anything, but I suspect that something about his mere presence may have played a part in this. He is really quite an unusual monk, someone who cheerfully does, any task that comes up in the monastery. He doesn't live in the monastery anymore, but he comes back regularly for sesshin. And the people that live at Sogenji can be a kind of an irascible person. And people always say they always appreciate it when they go to Sanzen directly after Dogen, because the Roshi is always in such a good mood then. But regarding this question of presence, back in 1981, when I was studying at Otani University in Kyoto, I was fortunate enough to hear the Dalai Lama speak in Japan during his first trip out of Dharamsala in India. And, at that time, he hadn't come famous like he is today. In Japan, he'd fill a stadium now. But back in those days, he was just given a large classroom at a nearby Buddhist university, and that was quite enough. Anyway, a group of us at Otani University heard about, the fact that he had arrived and that he would be speaking. So we went down there and we're sitting around waiting with the rest of the audience, talking to each other. And I really wasn't expecting anything at all. All I knew really of the Dalai Lama at that time was what I had read in Thomas Merton's Asian Journal. And there'd been a photograph of the Dalai Lama there, and he just sort of looked like a perfectly ordinary person. However, when the Dalai Lama entered the room, and before he'd even spoken a word, there was this immediate shift in the atmosphere of the room. It was almost like this feeling of something went shoo, and any tension that might have been in the air just disappeared, and it seemed to be immediately replaced by a kind of relaxed stillness. Now the change was quite palpable. I hadn't been expecting anything, but it was quite clear. I just hadn't been expecting anything like that. Now, I've heard people that, they've experienced the same sensations, they say, when in the presence of people like Ramana Maharshi, for example, or Krishnamurti, certain other teachers. It's almost as if a truly spiritual person creates a small pure land around him or herself. One that sort of pulls nearby people into a state of mind, somewhat like that of the spiritual person himself. And I wonder if something like this wasn't behind the origin of the entire Buddhist concept of Amida's Pure Land, or whatever, went before it. If even ordinary but nevertheless deeply spiritual people can, through their mere presence, influence the felt reality around them in this way, how much more so would this be the case with a fully enlightened Buddha? They could create an entire world. I see how that would be a perfectly logical conclusion. This all reminds me of something that's a little different, but in a way quite similar. It's a passage in the Gospel of Mark, the one about Jesus and his disciples in the crowded marketplace. Now, according to the Gospel, there was a woman there who had fallen ill for 12 years despite having spent all her money on doctors. When she saw Jesus, she thought, if I but touch the hem of his robe, I will be healed. So she went behind him and kind of secretly touched his robe and was indeed immediately cured of her illness. But what comes next in this passage is, to me, the most interesting part. The gospel goes on to say, Jesus felt the power go out of him, and he turned around and asked, "Who touched me?" And his disciples said, "Well, Master, we're in the crowded marketplace. All sorts of people have touched you." But Jesus continued to look around, and the woman finally confessed what she had done. And Jesus then said to her, "Go, daughter, your faith has healed you." What seems to me especially significant about this story is that Jesus did not deliberately heal the woman. All that was necessary was for the woman to be open, to be available to Jesus' healing energy. This suggests to me that, suggests a certain insight about spirituality, perhaps I could call it, that at a certain point, when spirituality becomes deep enough, being can become doing. In a sense, it's no longer necessary to deliberately do anything in order to influence the world. Christ, of course, he was active in the world, and didn't just spend time meditating in the desert. And this is the ultimate goal of contemplative practice. I've heard, Trappist monk friends say it's to achieve a selfless love so deep that it overflows into action. In any event, I think the point is that meditation is ultimately not just about self-liberation, but, as Buddhism says, the liberation of all beings. Okay, turning to something else, this being the ultimate goal of the path of meditation. I like here to shift gears a bit, well, actually quite a lot, and clarify a few points about what I regard as the beginning of the path of meditation, which, as I mentioned in my first talk, consists basically of the practices that we now call mindfulness meditation. In my first talk, I mentioned that what is now called mindfulness, that is, being in the present moment, forms the foundation of the various forms of meditation, and certainly those meditations that attempt to transcend the thought construct that is ego. Therefore, I'd like to talk a bit more directly about mindfulness, which I think has sometimes been subject to some misdirected criticism, some valid criticism too, of course. As I discussed in my earlier talk, by focusing on being in the present moment, mindfulness strives to free us from our identification with thought, since thought, being based on experience, is always of the past or future. All in all, I personally think that, modern mindfulness movement has been a positive development, but it has given rise to much discussion and some contention because it separates mindfulness, well, basically meditation practice, from the spiritual traditions that meditation has traditionally been associated with. And by going from there to connecting it with everything from sports to therapy to business management to everything in between. In one critique I read, the author castigated, is that the right word? Extremely critical, attacked mindfulness as a movement that would render everyone passively accepting of the status quo, preventing people from what he saw as really had to be done, which is to rise up and change everything that's wrong with the world. Well, I personally regard this particular criticism as quite off target. I think, as I mentioned in my previous talks, it's important to keep in mind that the open awareness and acceptance of meditation, what Buddhism calls equanimity, is quite different from passivity. If you want to meaningfully change a person or a situation in a positive way, the most important first step is the awareness and acceptance of the true reality of that person or situation. This best situates you to act in a meaningful and appropriate way. I mean, if your actions are based on your own preconceptions, you're just generating more illusions, I think. So all in all, I tend to be rather accepting of the way mindfulness has been applied to a wide range of activities that might not ordinarily be connected with spirituality. Mindful is, after all, I think there's some confusion maybe. The feeling that meditation and mindfulness in and of themselves are a kind of a virtue. I think they can serve virtue, but mindfulness particularly, I do not regard as a virtue. It's a quality of mind that, like courage, it's a mental quality that is kind of ethically neutral, making one more effective in it, whatever one does, whether that activity is sacred or profane, good or evil. If you're fighting a war and having to kill people, well, if you have courage, you can do it more effectively. If you're taking the meditative path, which can be quite frightening sometimes, if you have courage, you're going to be able to do it better. But courage and the ability to concentrate, in and of themselves, I do not think are virtues. As a monk, I feel, of course, that mindfulness is best applied to spiritual goals. But basically, I don't see anything wrong with practicing it to improve one's performance in sports, for example, or in managing a business. I mean, after all, if a person becomes interested in a practice like this, we can only start from where we are. And that may be sports. Also, I think mindfulness, regardless of what it's applied to, it introduces people to the importance and value of awareness. For example, an old monastic friend of mine who now works in California in alternative medicine, he often recommends progressive relaxation exercises, which I see as a form of mindfulness in increasing awareness of our physical sensations and in ameliorating physical problems associated with stress. With most patients, their practice of mindfulness just basically ends up, with the results it brings and the end of treatment. But not infrequently, my friend tells me, patients will come up to him and comment, doctor, that practice you recommended, I found it very interesting. Is there any way to go a bit deeper with this? And a lot of them get started in, a much more spiritual type of practice. So when mindfulness is applied to a spiritual practice, I think it's then that a certain ethical framework becomes necessary. Since, as I mentioned, mindfulness can serve both sacred and profane equally. And there's no guarantee that mindfulness practice alone will yield spiritually positive results, could yield spiritually negative results. I've noticed, sort of related to this, I've noticed over the years that a number of Christian pastors and monastics that I'm familiar with have taken up Zen practice, and quite a few of them have actually taken it all the way to being designated as Zen teachers. Some of these people I would count like Enomi Lassalle that I mentioned yesterday. I think I also mentioned Deaf Bookman, a couple of people that I really regard as among the most practiced people I know. And it's interesting that I've heard of almost no scandals connected with these teachers and their groups. And I think it's because, as Catholic monastics and, clergy people, it's because they have a firm ethical and moral structure to work within. I mean, the Catholic Church itself, of course, as everyone knows nowadays, has had more than its share of scandals. But these Catholic clerics that are drawn to meditation, tend to be genuinely spiritual people. And this, I think, along with the Christian ethical structure, has helped them to avoid the kind of problems that so often have arisen in many other Zen groups. Anyway, continuing with this subject of mindfulness, I think the extension of mindfulness, if we take mindfulness as far as it goes, it connects with what we call awareness. Now, awareness, at least, as I am using it here, I would define as mindfulness taken to the point where we can observe the world with a mind that no longer defines itself on the basis of its thought concept. So a mind that has broken beyond this identification with thought. The great spiritual teacher Krishnamurti, for example, he defines mindfulness as follows. Mindfulness is a lifelong inquiry into what it means to be present, which he italicizes, and to stay present in the present moment with choiceless awareness and bare attention, and with curiosity. I like his term choiceless awareness. I think this points toward that aspect of it no longer, it's an awareness that is no longer connected with the thinking process, or is free of it anyway, even if you are thinking. And curiosity suggests that, it's not just observing, but it's a kind of an active observing, asking maybe, what is it that is doing this observing? At any rate, I think, Krishnamurti, as always, defines the issue with unmatched clarity, but his words are perhaps a good introduction to the next matter I would like to take up. I mean, as anyone who has tried to meditate, and particularly done this kind of meditation that Krishnamurti is pointing to, this choiceless awareness type of meditation, I would characterize, for example, what Soto Shikantaza is trying to be. I would characterize as basically choiceless awareness with curiosity, as Krishnamurti says. Anyone who has tried to do this kind of meditation, I think they would probably agree that being in the present is a state of awareness. Well, it may be very simple, but that certainly doesn't mean it's at all easy. I mean, since thought is all that we've ever known of our minds, since coming into consciousness as children, and since we identify with thought as basically constituting what we are, staying in the present with choiceless awareness and bare attention, it's not only difficult, but it often feels quite frightening. I mean, at the beginning, you feel like you're going to lose yourself. This jump from simple mindfulness to the, simple mindfulness of the present moment to the deep awareness that is fully open to the mind prior to thought. I mean, this jump can be quite big, I think. And even myself, having been in a monastery for a number of years, living with the monks, for year in and year out, I would venture that probably most monks I knew were never able to effect this kind of shift. This shift from a kind of meditating, but with still this connection to the thinking mind, to this state of choiceless awareness and bare attention, which I would tend to regard as the beginning point of true meditation. Now, some teachers regard this difficulty, this problem that, so many people end up in the end not unable to make this jump. They regard it simply as a matter of insufficient explanation. They point out that this choiceless awareness is, in a sense, something that we already have, that it's basically the mind's natural state when it no longer identifies with, Mark Twain's storm of thought. And they therefore reject any technique or method that suggests awareness is something that has to be attained. Such methods, they say, simply add something extraneous to pure awareness and create new attachments for the meditator. Krishnamurti, of course, was, I think, the most famous example of this. I mean, wonderful teacher though he was well known for this kind of outlook. He writes, for example, meditation is a state of mind which looks at everything with complete attention, totally, not just parts of it. And no one can teach you how to be attentive. If any system teaches you how to be attentive, then you are attentive to the system, and that is not attention. Basically, Krishnamurti seems to be recommending that, you just be aware as an observer of the thinking process. And then, if you get confused and get caught up in the thoughts, well, just be aware of the confusion, Whatever comes up, just step back and be aware of that. So, basically, in other words, just drop your stories and don't take up any new ideas. It's very, very similar, I think, to what Linji was saying, but of course, he was saying it in a context of much deeper practice. But I think one of Zen master Rinzai, Linji in Chinese, one of his most famous sayings is, just drop your present thought and don't let the next thought arise. Just this will be of more value to you than 10 years of pilgrimage. The problem is that the words of teachers like Krishnamurti, true as they may be, can leave you with basically nothing to go on. I think people, particularly those without a lot of meditative experience, often comment that the mind state that these teachers are referring to, when they're in the company of the teacher, they often feel like, oh yeah, I can understand what he's driving at. And yet later, when they're away, they're unable to access it. I'd like to digress just a little bit, because this raises another point that I think may be very important. And it relates to what I was talking about before by, relating to this little pure land that very exceptional spiritual people can create around themselves. People go there, they listen to the teacher, they feel that everything is clear, and then they go home and it's not there anymore. The Buddhist popularizer Deepak Chopra, I don't agree with everything he writes, but he had a very, very interesting story. His uncle was a kind of a guru groupie. If his uncle heard about some new wonderful guru, he would take little Deepak, and say, well, let's go and meet this new guru. And they'd get on the train and they'd go to whatever town the guru lived nearby and get off the train and start walking toward the guru's little hut usually. And Deepak said that as they approached, he noticed that, if it was a really genuine guru, about 200-300 meters away, all of his usual worries and anxieties would start dropping off, and they would go and see the guru. Felt very good to be in his presence, and, uncle would carry on the usual conversation, and then the time would come to leave and they would head back to the train station, and at exactly the same 200 or 300 meters, all of his original worries and anxieties came back. And I think this is what happens. Something like this is what happens with a lot of teachers. they have this sort of a charisma, and people get addicted to it. They feel like they understand when they're around the teacher, but not when they're not around him. And so they try to stick around. Now, this is one of the reasons I think that Zen is so severe and why the Zen masters are always getting so angry in a very effective way often. They don't want their disciples to be reliant on them. They want them to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. So anyway, I think this can be a problem. Certain gurus that I've heard about who, you know, reading their stuff, they seem to have a very genuine insight, and yet they attract these groups of people that just never leave, and the guru ends up having to like order them away. Okay, at any rate, let's proceed. The Japanese have a saying going back to this matter of not teaching any technique, that technique can actually be a hindrance. The Japanese have a saying that goes, "Mizu kyokereba wo sumazu." Fish can't live in water that's too pure. Teachings that try to avoid giving students anything new to attach to often end up giving them nothing to work with. Almost everyone requires some kind of technique or structure to start with, I think. I mean, there are the occasional geniuses that, you know, just basically it's very natural to them, but most people that I've seen anyway require some kind of technique or structure. If they're ever to get to the place where they no longer need techniques or structures. I mean, it's like training wheels on a bicycle or something like that. So I'd like to describe a couple of techniques that I think, well, I've seen, you know, be helpful for other people and that have been helpful for me. Well, I did discuss already a couple of these, Goenka's technique of sweeping and Shinzen Young's technique of noting, which I described somewhat in my first talk. Today, I'd like to describe a technique that kind of crosses the border, I think, between the categories of positive and negative meditation. It's a technique that, you know, anyone interested in or familiar with Tibetan Buddhism will certainly have heard of. And this is the meditation known as Tonglen, which in Tibetan means giving and taking or sending and receiving. This is a practice I've heard that the Dalai Lama does every day. I think I heard somewhere that he gets up early and does this for 5 hours. But anyway, what the practice involves is something that sounds actually rather counterintuitive at first. I mean, you start by visualizing the suffering of a particular individual or a particular group, or you can even, you know, sort of visualize the suffering of the entire body of humanity. You then breathe in this suffering, and then when you breathe out, you exhale peace, health, happiness, and whatever else might be a benefit to those who, you know, who the meditation is intended for. According to the explanation I heard, it's not that you're purifying this yourself. The visualization should be that on the in-breath, you visualize the suffering as just passing through you like a channel to the unconditioned, this kind of unconditioned universal consciousness. And there it's purified, and then this purified energy just again passes out through you to whatever the intended target is. Now, it might sound a little bit shocking, you know, to deliberately breathe in negative energy like this, but my own experience with this practice is that it fosters very positive feelings. The Dalai Lama, for example, he points out that it increases, I mean, he lists a few things, you know, it increases awareness of other people's suffering, it cultivates altruism, it reduces selfish attachments, and it goes a long way to breaking down the sense of separation between self and other. He says, whether this meditation really helps others or not, I don't know, but it gives me peace of mind. And then I can be more effective, and the benefit is immense. Again, it struck me that this might be a particularly useful meditation for many of the countries, in the world today. My own country of America, we're completely divided along political lines, and the two sides are just simply not even talking to each other anymore. The very words they use mean different things. And I think it can be, and I have often seen, that it is a very short step from complete disagreement to outright hatred. With this meditation, where you imagine, okay, everybody in America, whether I agree with them or not, they're all suffering. This is just a fact of existence. And if I can use that fact to breathe in this suffering of everybody, whether I agree with them or not, and then, have this purified and then breathe it out, well, it may not make any practical difference, in the political problems or experience in America today, but it will at least not contribute more to the negative energy that is behind all of this. It really is very tempting. Again, the ego likes to be very right and everyone very wrong. But basically, I think these kind of feelings just contribute to this problem. If, you as an individual, at least, as the Dalai Lama says, if at least you can be positive toward everyone, then that is, at the very least, one little step toward resolving the situation we're in today. Okay, the final technique, which I, as a Zen monk, would be very remiss in not considering, is the koan. Once again, my friend and fellow meditator Shinzen Young, I think, described what ideally the koan as a method is aiming for, really about as well as it can be described. Let me read what he said. Shinzen says, and this is, by the way, a description almost exactly like, but better expressed, than what I have heard from bona fide Rinzai Zen Roshis. Shinzen says, a koan is a problem you can't solve with a rational mind. It is a question that is asked you that in fact boggles the rational mind and produces immense disorientation and confusion. What it means to solve the koan means to have complete equanimity, complete acceptance of that confusion, and to let it fill your entire being, all your waking hours, and not to need to do anything about that fact. If you're willing to do that long enough, then you gradually work through the habit of needing to have answers. In other words, the koan is a sort of forced abstinence from the addiction of the mind to meaning. Our minds are addicted to meaning. Have you noticed? They have to have meaning, moment by moment. They have to have clarity. It's a kind of addiction. A teacher throwing a koan into your conceptual mind jams the mechanism and makes it hard to have meaning. You're just confused all the time. You're in chaos all the time conceptually. And at first you flail around a bit trying to figure out an answer with thought. But if you really understand how this whole thing works, you give up on that. And you just abide, progressively more and more comfortable with your entire being in confusion, until finally your mind starts to function undriven by the fear of confusion. It just happens. The mind just happens the way rain just happens. And the answer just occurs the way rain just falls. That, of course, I think it's a very accurate description of the way the koan should work. But I think, and I should precede my comments hereafter by saying that the koan system, it's definitely a system that has fully proved its worth for, over 1,000 years now, as the central practice of the Rinzai traditions of Zen Buddhism. But I think at the same time, it's important to remember that it's a technique that, though it's formed and influenced, I think, by very deep truths and insights, it is nevertheless the product of the human mind, and thus is one that can't resolve in and of itself all of the complex issues involved in the spiritual path. I mean, there's no such thing with any practice of one size fits all. I mean, it obviously works very well for some people. The great modern Zen master, who I've mentioned a couple times, Yamada Mumon, he highly valued, even loved the koans as a tool for meditative practice. And this is true of my own teacher for many years, Yamada Mumon's disciple, Harada Shodo Roshi. Harada Roshi would say that without koan work, it's very difficult to cultivate the wisdom facility. But another teacher who I practiced under, right at the beginning of my Zen practice actually, a master named Kato Kozan Roshi, he had quite a different view of the koans. Now, Kato Kozan Roshi started his Zen training when, during his sort of college age years with, of all people, Shakyamuni Roshi. And Shakyamuni Roshi was another Roshi who very much liked the koans, but Kato Kozan found himself just kind of flying through the koans. The answers just seemed intuitively obvious to him, and they didn't pose any challenge. So he finally just wondered, what am I doing? And he gave up the practice and became a Soto monk for, I think, a couple decades until he went back to Rinzai training. And he ended up becoming one of the most highly regarded Zen masters. Not all that well known, but a very, very highly regarded Zen master by the people who knew him. And this was despite the fact that he was married and lived in what was just a small mountain temple in the mountains west of Tokyo. Kato Kozan Roshi, his attitude was that as a Rinzai Roshi, or anyone who's a Rinzai monk, the koans are basically something you just have to do if you are a Rinzai monk. But he didn't really regard the koan practice as central to the practice. For him, and I've seen this kind of dichotomy in the masters I've known, for him, maintaining and continuing a deep samadhi practice was something that he regarded as far more important. He said that all of the major challenges that he had faced in life were resolved through a deep Zazen practice. Now, similarly, a friend of mine, Priscilla Daichi Storant, who has served as Harada Shodo Roshi's assistant and translator for 40 years, has seen probably, at least hundreds of people in the Sanzen room over the course, over 40 years of service to Harada Roshi. And she says that in her experience, these koans work very well for maybe about a third of the students. And these are the people that the koans really get their teeth into, and they give rise to the kind of doubt that really can power a good Zazen practice. But he says there's other students who, some of them, like for example, Kato Kozan, they seem to have an intuitive grasp of what's going on, and they just pass one koan after another without any sort of sense of challenge or transformation. Other students are frightened off by them. Others may be very good meditators, actually, but they just find the koans completely meaningless, even when they're quite successful at passing them. Several of Harada Roshi students over the decades, they've finished the koan system and gone on to become successful teachers. I think there's maybe 3 or 4, mostly based in Europe. But there are 2 students I know who were with the Roshi for over 10 years and pretty much covered all of the koans. And at the end of it, they folded up their robes and gave them back to the Roshi and said, "I'm sorry, all of this has meant nothing to me." It really didn't answer any of the questions they felt that they had gone into Zen training for. I recently heard a quite interesting story from a friend of mine, an American monk named Barent Arslanian. His monk's name is Jun. Jun is presently the longest serving Zen training monk in Japan. He's been in the monastery about 20 years now, and he is almost certainly going to become a successor of Yamakawa Sogen Roshi, who I regard really as one of the best Roshis in Japan now. At any rate, Jun, who himself, he finds the koans very, very frustrating, but for that very reason, extremely useful in his own practice. He told me a very, very interesting story that he had just heard from a training monk at another monastery. Now, apparently, the Zen master at that other monastery, along with his, formal training monks living there at the monastery, he had a lay student who was really quite capable. Apparently, this fellow was a professor at a university in the city, and he'd done koan work under the master for many years, continued it, pretty much to the end. And he'd done so well, and his insights that he demonstrated were so good that the master finally decided to designate this student as his successor as master at the monastery. However, it being a formal Rinzai training monastery, the professor would first have to ordain, as a regular Buddhist monk, and he would also have to spend a little bit of time in the monastery. I mean, if he was to be recognized as a bona fide teacher in the Rinzai Zen tradition, the master basically considered all of this to be pro forma. He could spend maybe 2 years or so in the monastery, and that would probably be enough. Well, at any rate, the professor duly got his head shaved and entered the monastery as a training monk. Of course, he was at the bottom of the monastery hierarchy as the newest arrival. And since nowadays, there's really not too many monks at any monastery, he was already assigned a few duties as the newest monk. And one of the duties he was supposed to do was to close the monastery gate at the end of the monastic day. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, one day, not long after the professor entered the monastery, the monks went out in the morning and they saw that he had forgotten to close the gate. Now, this is a pretty basic job, so the head monk, of course, scolded him for neglecting this, important responsibility. And the professor became so angry at having been scolded like this that he gathered up his profession and stomped out of the monastery. And, well, I have no doubt that the insight that he demonstrated in his koan practice was, basically, I'm sure, quite genuine. But what can you say, In a very real sense, he had learned nothing about the spiritual life. And I think, there's a very important lesson here for Zen, particularly Rinzai Zen, where we tend to, if anything, overemphasize the importance of the koans. I mean, the koans foster wisdom, they foster understanding, but understanding alone is not enough. I mean, I think all of us who sit here, and lecture on Buddhism are quite aware of how easy it is for understanding to outstrip our ability to actually embody the teachings in everyday life. I mean, Zen training is not just about wisdom. It has to be a complete package, and it's got to involve relationships as well. I mean, after all, it only took, a week or two of living in the Zen community to reveal exactly where the professor was in his training. Ultimately, Zen, I think like all Buddhism, it's got to be ultimately about helping others, and that involves entrusting and self-surrender, as I discussed, in my talk yesterday. And it's there, I think, that Shin Buddhism and Zen come together. Okay, well, maybe that's a good note to end the talk on, and I would certainly welcome any questions that people might have.
Okay.
Is it on there? Yeah. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you. Have we any questions from the audience or from online?
No question ever,
Once again, you seem like a Japanese audience. Where no one, usually if one person asks a question, then it turns out that a lot of people had questions. But that first question is always hard, I guess.
I think, this reliance on technique, whether it's koan or sitting meditation, is a sort of a problem for many students, because they think it's to do with, being able to sit for hours in a rigid position, and that they get strength out of that.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't really do what's needed. And they can even be shouted and screamed at and not move.
Uh-huh.
But actually, they're just like a suit of armor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there can be a sort of a samurai result in the Zen practice. That's one of the dangers, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wonder, have you any sort of comments on that,
Yeah, I mean, it's an undeniable fact. Who knows really what makes the difference? Why do some people seem to get it? I mean, this is a basic directionality, I think. If you go into the practice with, the intention to make yourself so strong that an island so that pain can no longer reach you, or is there something in you that motivates you to go into the practice as a way to really get to the bottom of this whole question of suffering? And I don't really know what that is. I can only call it a kind of goodwill, maybe, a certain dynamic that motivates you to move in the direction, of self-understanding and self-surrender and these things. And I don't really know where that comes from. I guess the Buddhists, Indian Buddhism would say that's probably a product of karma. I really don't know. But without it, without that kind of what I can only call goodwill, I don't think that's a very good term, but I was talking to you the other evening. I said it's like trying to make the perfect loaf of bread. and you get the highest quality wheat, and you find the purest water from the highland glens of Scotland and wonderful sea salt, and you put it all together and you mix it up, and you decide that it's not important to put any yeast in there. And then, you bake it in an oven, and, well, you're going to end up with something, but it's not going to be bread. You've kind of left out the essential ingredient. But where does that come from? Yeah, I think Buddhism tries to foster that through these positive meditations. Certainly, I think through lifestyle habits that the precepts are intended to internalize in you. But beyond that, there's really not much I can say, I think. Yeah.
Hi. There are a few questions online. The first one is, could you just briefly explain samadhi again?
Samadhi?
Yeah.
Well, samadhi, to the extent that I can explain it, goes back to what I was describing about learning to observe the mind processes to the extent that you are able not only to sort of, as an observer, observe the individual thoughts as they arise, but to be aware also of the times of natural silence in the mind, to the point where you can be so open to and aware of and unresisting to those times of silence that mind movement can rise up and dissipate without ever forming a thought. It's not a suppression of mind movement. It's a kind of a freeing from any kind of attachment or suppression or, tension toward mind movement. It sort of seemed to me like surfing mind energy in a way. Now, I'm sure there's deeper level, obviously they talk in the Buddhist literature about deeper levels of samadhi, and I'm not really qualified to mention those, but I think this level of what might be called samadhi is in and of itself very, very beneficial to the spiritual life. It allows you to stop defining yourself on the basis of thought, for example, because you see that thought is relatively shallow. It allows you to work with mind habits, I think, in a much easier way. It can even, to some extent, I think, change your views toward what death might involve. So, yeah, that's about all I can say, I think.
All right. Next question is, what advice do you have for novice meditator?
The novice meditator, again, I think, like I said yesterday, well, I should start out, I think, by saying that this is another case where one size doesn't fit all. I think some people do benefit, certainly at the beginning, from a practice that is a little bit forced. Generally speaking, though, I have found that usually does not end well. I have had friends that have had tremendous concentrative power. And at Shofukuji, when I was there, had kind of breakthroughs that were recognized by Yamada Bumon Roshi, a very, very genuine Roshi, if there ever was one, as genuine breakthroughs. But they were kind of experiences that I think were fostered by this kind of concentrative energy, and they always just disappeared after 2 months, 3 months, however long, and left this particular individual that I'm thinking of more confused than he was at the beginning. He actually just quit the practice for years after that. So my recommendation is, if you find the more forced type of meditation helpful at the beginning, okay, use it, but please do so cautiously. But generally speaking, I would recommend that people begin a meditative practice in the direction of letting go and opening up and relaxing, which is basically just a physical manifestation of letting go. So use, for example, the breathing technique as a way not to force your mind to remain on the breath, for example, but some more of a relaxed imbuing of the breath with consciousness. Just whenever you notice you're thinking, as you always will, don't try to force your mind into silence, but just keep continually redirecting the mind to the sensations of the moment, to the sensations of breathing, to the sensations of sitting, and just keep doing this again and again. I mean, it's like learning a sport. You have to be patient. It's going to take a while to learn the basics. I also recommend, this is something that Zen doesn't speak about too much, but I think, Vipassana speaks about more, and I think it's very, very good advice. First of all, to look for opportunities for mini meditations throughout the day. For example, even when your phone rings, you have time for one breath meditation or a 3-ring meditation. And that sort of creates a little gap between your ordinary state of mind. If you're waiting for a red light as you're in a hurry, and you're driving somewhere and the red lights keep coming up, you can use those as opportunities for 1 minute of meditation instead of getting angry. That's not going to help, change the lights any faster. But the day is full of these opportunities for little mini meditations. So combining those with the regular meditation periods. Also using negative feelings for meditation. Because you notice these because they're unpleasant. And one of them that's very easy to use, I found, is irritation. Because irritation tends to come up in everyday life fairly often. You're waiting for something, and why isn't this line moving faster, or whatever, And it's accompanied by physical manifestations that you can use to go back to the present moment. How is this irritation affecting me? Does it make my shoulders stiffer? Do I feel it in my solar plexus? Et cetera, et cetera. What kind of thoughts is this irritation trying to make me think? That can be very, very useful, not only for deepening meditation, but for self-understanding. Going from there, but this is getting out of, I think, meditation for beginners, to try to move from there into observing the thought process. That's getting, I think, though, into kind of practice that really requires, week retreats and a more serious practice. Oh.
Okay. There are few questions here. The next question is, could you elaborate a bit on negative meditation? I have never heard that expression before.
Yeah. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I take it from the term via negativa, the negative way in Christian contemplative prayer. This means that it's not negative in the sense of not being good or causing problems, but negative in the sense that you are negating the thought process that we usually identify with. And you negate the thought process by focusing on that which, as much as possible, is not related to thought. So as I described, the sensations of the present moment. Deepen that, as you go deeper. Just, so the Soto practice actually, if you've really accomplished something in meditation, the Soto practice of shikantaza, just remaining with a completely open mind that, as Dogen describes it, is aware of every movement and every thought that arises even before it arises. This can be, I think, a very, very effective form of negative meditation. So basically it's that. I mean, Christianity tends to use other things. The Cloud of Unknowing uses a kind of a mantra. Just fill your mind with this mantra, and it's one that also tends to generate, positive thought, positive states of mind. St. John of the Cross. I mean, if this person is interested in negative meditation as it exists in Christianity, St. John of the Cross has books, on the various states of mind and stages that this via negativa goes through. So, might be interested in those.
Okay. Next is, what is the difference between mindfulness meditation and the Buddhist meditation in terms of technique? How long you sit or what you are thinking?
Mindfulness meditation and what kind of meditation?
Buddhist meditation. Mindfulness meditation and Buddhist meditation.
I'm not catching that second word.
Let me read it again. What is the difference between mindfulness meditation and the Buddhist meditation?
Oh, just Buddhist meditation?
Yeah, in terms of technique.
Yeah, in terms of technique, I think they're exactly the same. I mean, let me restate that. Buddhist meditation takes many forms. The Nembutsu is a form of Buddhist meditation, of course. But what mindfulness does, as I've described, awareness of the present moment, that is an old and honored and tradition form of meditation that you find in Buddhism. I actually had here that I scratched out because I realized I wasn't going to have enough time for it. But if I can find it, I mean, there are passages, well, just to summarize, I mean, there are passages in the Pali scriptures about, the present breath is just the present breath. A long breath is a long breath. Short breath is a short breath. Just being one with what is going on in the present moment. So in that respect, mindfulness meditation as it is very much a Buddhist practice. However, the modern mindfulness movement and what it's criticized for, has been to try to rid the practice of meditation from any kind of spiritual associations or connections. In order to make it, I mean, with the best of motives by the people that started it, like John Kabat-Zinn, I think, who wanted to make it available to people of different belief systems. I think that limits mindfulness to some extent, so maybe that's a difference that could be pointed up. It does leave mindfulness meditation open, as I was hinting at in this paper, to heading off in certain wrong directions that the same meditation within a spiritual context could probably avoid. Those would be the main differences that I would identify. Okay.
I still have three more questions here. So can I read them? Three more questions. Do you have time?
I'm happy to answer questions as long as, but you have a schedule too.
Yeah, she has one more. Yeah?
One more, yeah?
Okay. But she was waiting.
Yeah, she was waiting.
Yeah.
Okay. And go.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It's so valuable for us, especially novice meditation. I haven't been practicing. Yesterday, some of our Dharma friends were talking about what it feels like to be receive enlightenment. In a way, it's a kind of a skewed question. In a way, it's the question would be simplified. What it feels like to be advanced practitioner, in the higher place where you are mastered the practice your meditation. What it feels like to be there.
Yeah. I tried to avoid that question by stating at the outset that I am not a master. I regard myself as a rather ordinary person who's just kind of stuck with the practice because I felt I had no options, psychologically, in many ways, and have found it to be a very rewarding practice, even for, a person of quite ordinary attainments like myself. And I kind of wanted to introduce those aspects. What I found myself, as far as I can go, as someone who, you have tastes of the sort of thing that this person is asking about, I think. But, even someone, I think, with just a maintained and continued and regular practice, there is this state that I have described many times, of disidentifying with thought, learning to disidentify with thought. And this is what I think anyone with with good instruction, anyone in this room could attain, at the very least, that level of meditation. And I do think that even that can be very, very liberating, as I was mentioning before. The deeper states, I've come across books that I think, of people who I think have certainly seen much more than I have. I came across one recently that I found very, very interesting, called One Blade of Grass. It's by an Englishman, actually, named Henry Shakyamuni, I think. He's now teaching in America. In the Sambo Kyodan tradition, he describes a lot of states that he may well have had, but probably because he was a rather much more sensitive person maybe than most people, and that I do not think are necessary on the spiritual path. But his conclusions about what the path is trying to head for and the sort of fruits it's had in his own life, I found very, very kind of compelling descriptions of how it really does seem to lessen the sense of separation between self and other. The way that it seems to foster a quite natural love that just flows out towards all of existence, and even a real sense of oneness, with the universe. So, might be something to look into. Yeah. Sorry?
It's the process is ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, for everyone, I think, you do what you can with the way, so.
Thank you. Thank you so much indeed.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you a question. On your last talk, you mentioned very briefly in passing Alan Watts, and I used to be familiar to a certain extent with his writings. And could you please elaborate or say your impressions on non-doing or wu-wei, something that Alan mentions in his writings? So this essentially, I would like to understand an avoidance of goals, having a goal as a hindrance, and also having a benefit as a hindrance, because from what I've understood from Alan's writings, treating any practice as of benefit is a sort of a hang-up, a sort of stuck-up situation. Thank you.
Yeah, the problem with that question is that it's actually a very, very subtle issue, I think. I mean, this is something that the great Zen master, how is it pronounced? Dawei, I think, in Japanese, Dae, who was one of the central figures in the development of the koan system in China back in the late 1000s, in the 1000s, and who was always stressing the necessity of having a clear awakening experience, that you couldn't dismiss this. It wasn't genuine practice unless you made enlightenment your standard, is the way he put it. And yet he was always insisting that the worst thing you can do when you sit is to sit with the idea of attaining something. So there has to be this kind of, what can you call it? It's not exactly a balance, but this tension in which you're trying to orient yourself towards something and yet not strain through your own abilities to attain that goal, and yet through your own abilities creating that state which is able to receive from, from the side of enlightenment. And, if you just say, well, you should never have any goals, well, okay, well then I may not do the practice. I guess that's the easiest way not to have any goals in practice. And that would that would defeat the whole purpose. Non-doing, again, it's a very attractive concept. I think probably to know what it really means, you would have to be a very advanced practicer, sort of in the 10 ox-herding pictures. Well, ultimately, the 10th picture when you're back in the marketplace, just acting naturally, and yet your mere presence sort of is a way of teaching. But how do you get to that point? Yeah, I mean, it's I guess a series of slow progressions. I think, trying to apply the lessons of meditation in everyday life, because what you're doing in everyday life, of course, is almost always goal-oriented. You drive a car in order to reach a certain place. You pull weeds in order to create your garden in a certain sense. But if you can do that, and as they're constantly telling us in Zen training, nari kiru, become one with what you're doing. Just do that. I mean, you may know at some level that you're doing, you're washing the dishes to get them clean, and you will be scolded if you don't, While you're doing that, try to be free of thoughts of, thoughts in a way are always goal-oriented. I mean, thoughts of the past, experiences that were unpleasant, and again, these kind of I am right and that person wrong. The goal there is to strengthen your own ego, justify your own ego. So anytime you can just do something in a state of awareness, I think that, whatever stage of the path you're on, shallow or deep, that is a kind of wu wei. Yeah.
I saw something by Shaku Soen Shaku. He talked about the practice, Dharma practice in general, like a love affair. He said sometimes you feel very warm and loving towards the object of your love, and sometimes it seems to fade away and you get rather fed up. But you don't give up, you just carry on. Your love changes through time, and it gets deeper and wider and more profound. But if you just start and then just have a flush of pleasure and then it's gone, nothing ever comes out of anything like that. But Tom, I want to really thank you so much for your wonderful talks. And also, I should say to those of you online, we will be doing some seminars later in the year. But those of you who are interested in that, please will you sign up for it? And then Tom will be back in Japan probably at some point, but it'll probably be next term, sort of in September. But we'll be doing seminars on all the talks, including Tyra's, right the way through. We don't know exactly what form. It depends on those who are interested and want to join in. They'll all be online, and so please think of that, because I'm sure it'll be very beneficial for us all. I've certainly learned a lot myself, and every time I hear something, I learn something. Now, next week, it's going to be all online. So it's on Tendai Buddhism, and you're most welcome. Please come and attend. And so thank you all very much for coming and attending so far. And see you online. Thank you. Caspar, and thank you, Tyra,
Thank you.
for being here. And everybody who's put all the work into it. And we're going to go have some tea downstairs. Hopefully.